Welcome to SIM-PAC Live. I'm your host, Jeff Matthews. Today we talk to Jane Gaffel and Penny Prasad from the Ecoefficiency Group about the Queensland Manufacturing Sustainability Benchmark Program. Welcome, Jane and Penny.
Hi, Jeff. Nice to be here.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm very good. Excited to learn all about the Queensland Manufacturing Sustainability Benchmark Program. Who's going to tell me about that?
Righto. I'll kick off, shall I? So the Sustainability Benchmark Program. So Jane and I submitted a tender, it's probably about 4 years ago, I'd say. It was a Queensland Government request for tender to deliver a sustainability benchmark program. And we submitted our proposal, and ours was heavily, benchmarking, but heavily sustainability based. And we were lucky enough to win that tender, which has been very exciting for us over the last couple of years. So that's how it started.
And what was the tender for? Give me the brief of it.
Well, I guess it's benchmarking, but specifically to support manufacturing companies across Queensland and give them an idea of how they're performing with respect to the amount of resources that they're using and the waste that they're generating and efficiencies generally within a manufacturing company and what they can do to be more productive, more efficient and reduce their overall environmental footprint. So that's sort of the premise behind the benchmarking, and also the important thing was to try to get together a baseline for individual companies so that they can compare themselves to other like companies. And where possible, we were researching benchmarking data that was available publicly. So, for example, food and beverage sector, so fruit juice processing, for example, has a lot of KPIs attached to it. So we were researching what those benchmarks were for different sectors and bringing that information back to those companies so that they could get a good understanding of how they were performing.
Yeah. Wow. Just as an overview, you would have seen a lot of change in 4 years, I'm assuming. Can you tell, just before we get into the nitty-gritty of things, what you've seen over the last 4 years when you started off benchmarking companies for, emissions, and what you're seeing now?
Yeah, I think when we talk to companies, we talk to them about what their drivers are for being more efficient and being more sustainable. So it's different for different companies depending on what sort of supply chain they're in and who their customers are. And so one of the big changes that we've seen over the last 4 years is just this increasing requirement to do public reporting and to report particularly greenhouse gas emissions within their supply chain. So that's been one of the big drivers that we've seen for companies to start, to get together this baseline information and track a bit more closely the amount of resources that they're using and the emissions and the waste that they're producing. So that's been one of the big drivers. And we see, Jane and I have been doing this kind of work for 20 odd years, and we've seen sort of different drivers come and go. Just, take water, for example, at the height of the drought around, between 2008 to 2011. Water was an important resource, and many manufacturing companies were having to do water audits and reduce their water consumption. So we've sort of seen that wave, but then since then, a big driver is really to do with the greenhouse gas emissions and getting a handle on that.
And Jane, do you think the tier 1 reporting, do you think it's trickling down? I mean, I'm talking to other people who are saying that if you don't have reporting environmental product declarations, you're not going to be able to trade with tier 1 companies, let alone EU and other overseas companies.
Yeah, it's definitely trickling down, particularly in the mining sector. We're already finding that companies are having to report emissions already, even before mandatory reporting is in place. The companies that they do work with are requiring this information from them. And supermarket companies as well. That's starting to trickle down. I think it's going to be even more important as those first lot of companies are having to do their mandatory reporting. The first year they don't report on Scope 3 emissions, but the second year they're having to start look at their Scope 3 emissions, and that's when the supply chain is really going to come into it. Also, just tenders, reports from companies
Yes.
that they just need a sustainability strategy to answer a tender. And it's a section in a tender now. It's not just a tick and a flick at the bottom of a tender requirement. It's actually, do you have a sustainability strategy? Do you have environmental plans, etc.? And they're having to show that they've got those. And that's where we found that some companies sign up to this program because they want to establish that strategy for that tender process.
Yes. And Penny, I understand the subsidy for this for doing this benchmarking work is closing very shortly,
Yeah,
and so companies have got to get in.
yeah, that's right, Jeff. So the program's been running for a couple of years now, and it's due to finish. Officially, our contract ends at the end of January 2026. But the last sort of batch of companies, they really need to be signed on pretty much by the end of December just to get things running. And yeah, it is heavily subsidised by Queensland Government. So for companies that have less than 100 employees, their out-of-pocket expense is about $2,000 for us to do an assessment. And for companies with over 100 employees, it's about $2,500 out of pocket. And that's the 40% cost which the company supplies, and then the government's subsidising 60%. So it's really
60% subsidy is pretty good.
It's really
it's double a battery subsidy.
Yes, it's very good value for money. And there's a lot of work that goes into doing these benchmark assessments.
I can imagine.
Getting the data especially is it's a good lesson for companies, actually, just just for them to get their processes in place with respect to data collection, because that's becoming more and more important, especially with the climate related reporting. And just knowing where their data is to begin with that's a learning curve all in itself.
I was going to say, and also just what data you need, because quite often people know they need their electricity bills, but they forget about their forklifts or their fleet vehicles, and that's also energy, Scope 1 emissions that they need to be reporting on. And they just, it doesn't really cross their mind that might be something that they need to get, and that fuel cards and really tricky data that's not necessarily, it's not a simple bill. You get one number off the bill to tell you your total electricity consumption. Amassing the information from your fuel cards can be tricky.
So get in quick is the call to action here, because this is a really generous subsidy from the government. It's a very important piece of work that you've got to start now. Everyone's going to have to do this, so you're going to have to pay full price for it if you don't get in now. That's the message from today.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, so you've done over 60 of these assessments in the past 4 years. You've been busy.
Very busy. Having a lot of fun, I must say. Visiting some pretty interesting companies.
Yeah, it's definitely the benefit of the program. We get to go inside manufacturing sites and seeing what people are doing. It's so much more interesting than going into an office and talking about lights and air conditioning. Actually seeing equipment that people are using and the processes are there. We definitely enjoy our job, that's for sure.
The Ecoefficiency Group, the eco-efficiency and part of it, I'm assuming that you can walk into companies and you can see low-hanging fruit, really easy wins for companies to make, and that not only reduces emissions, but also is operationally better and also is cost effective. You know, how many of those easy wins have you seen?
Yeah, I think there's always an easy win. Most companies have started to do lighting, generally the high bay lights, so the big ones in the warehouses or in the production floor. Most of those have been changed over or progressively being changed over. But there's things like the office lights are still there and security lights. We do find air leaks, and I think the benefit of having an external person come into your site is that we find people know their site so well, they don't notice things. And so we'll come in and go, what about that there? Well, I can hear the hiss of an air leak. And they go, oh, yes, that's right. And they're just things that we see that, they probably, if they had the time, again, I think it's that they're so busy in their normal day-to-day job that they don't take the time to sort of stop and look at it afresh. And there's just a few things we pick out. Rubbish bins is another one, waste segregation. They might have a recycling bin, but quite often, it's not set up well on site. So people obviously use the closest bin they can find, and generally always there'll be, cardboard in the general waste, the landfill bin. And there's just a few quick and easy wins that we see when we turn up.
And what do you get for the report? And what's going to stop it sitting on the shelf? I mean, is this translating into action?
Yeah, so with the assessment that we do, there's three clear parts to the assessment. So the stage one, it's a really sort of a helicopter view of a company's sustainability strategy. So we've got an online tool that we use to assess that. It's got 60 odd questions in it, and it's based around a sustainability framework where we look at management commitment, how efficient a company is within their own operations, what are they doing across their supply chain, and how are they engaging with their suppliers and customers to be more efficient and reduce waste. How are they using sustainability to create value for the company? And then lastly, what can they do to be a leader within their sector? So that's stage one of the program. Stage two is where we create the baseline for the company. So we'll collect 12 months of energy, water and waste data, and we'll do a desktop analysis of that data and have a look at, particularly with energy bills, and look at what tariff they're on and what demand charges they might have. And with the 12 months of the data that we're collecting, we also calculate the scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions for a company. And this still with stage two, we go in and do the site visit, which is generally 3 to 4 hours, where we're walking through the site and discussing with them, the entire process and what efficiency gains, what have they done over the last couple of years to make improvements, what are they thinking about doing, and then we'll sort of try to pick out efficiency gains that we see through the site visit. So that's the second part of the assessment. And then the third part is trying to support that implementation. So quite a few of the companies that have engaged with us, they've used our reports to support grant applications or other tenders. So that's particularly with the grant applications, there's been, quite a number that have been successful with their particular grants, and using our reports as sort of a third party, objective support, saying that, yes, we recommend that you go ahead and do this. And then the last
That's
part,
awesome.
yeah.
I mean, that's awesome. It pays for itself, doesn't it? Your assessment just got paid for by the grant.
That's right. And then the other part with the implementation, and it's something that was just introduced in the last 18 months or so. So we're now using a sustainability software program called Green KPI. And the reason that we chose to go with Green KPI for this is because it's heavily focused on integrating sustainability into the day-to-day operations of a company. So with that platform, the companies take the actions that we recommend in our report, they put that into the software program, And then it's set up to create alerts. You know, they'll allocate an action to a staff member, and then there's regular alerts, you know, that say, how are you going with this action? You know, what stage of the project, if it's a full project, what stage are you at? And so the staff are, you know, putting in information about where they are with their actions, and then there's that sort of regular prompt just to help try to integrate the sustainability actions into the day-to-day business. So that's the other aspect, that we're
yes, because it's got to be organisational wide, and it's got to become part of just what we do.
That's exactly right. That's right. Obviously, the more it can be integrated, it just becomes the part of doing business, and it's not an add-on. It's not the sustainability manager's job and leave that to him or her. It's everyone's job.
And what have you found has been the response from the people that you've done the benchmarking from? I mean, what's their response like? I've heard that from other consultants who have started carbon reporting or emissions reporting, that companies found the process much easier than they thought it was going to be. They thought it was going to be a nightmare, and actually it was like, well, yeah, that was okay.
Yeah, I think I mentioned before about the data collection. So I think the first time around is always a bit difficult with respect to the data collection aspect. So once the companies have done it once and they know what's expected, then it does get easier. I think particularly with the greenhouse gas emissions, I mean, working out what the scope 1 and 2 emissions are is really not that difficult. It's the scope 3 that's I think people they hear a lot when they're reading, and they hear a lot about scope 3 being complicated and all of these things, and that's what a lot of the companies are probably a bit wary about. And it's still a bit of a moving feast with respect to scope 3 emissions. But as far as our benchmarking goes, Jane, we've had quite a few companies that have come back for repeat assessments, and
and they've really appreciated the first report. It's been good to see, particularly the sustainability strategy that we develop in part 1. A couple of companies, we've actually seen them just go through those action items one by one and implement them. You know, it's sort of bite-sized amounts, so they can actually implement them and feel like they're achieving something. And one company in particular was one of our first companies, and they've just over a couple of years have just gone through that sustainability strategy and just implemented things. So it's really good to see that our suggestions are coming through. One company in particular, I just visited again earlier this year, and one of our suggestions was their waste management. You know, putting the bins next to each other, establishing waste management stations, and they had done that. And you walk in and you go, oh, that's fantastic. That was my suggestion. And they'd made little cubby holes for all the different waste types. They'd even started, if they stationery that they didn't need any more folders and things like that would go out in the break room, and people could take them home rather than going into landfill, which they would previously. And then they had a basket there for staff to bring in produce from their own garden that they had excess. And so people would have lemons or what else do they have? Apples and things like that. They just had produce that they made in their garden. They brought that in for the whole company to just take. So it was really lovely to see that it's starting to establish that culture of sustainability within their company, just from a few, from our benchmark suggestions.
And Jane, have you seen any obvious aha moments come out of the data that you've done for people?
Yes, we find it quite often. People haven't consolidated their data into one place. So one company in particular, they were paying to have wastewater treatment taken from their site. They were at the end of an industrial estate and there was no sewer connection, and they were working with explosives, so that water had to be extracted from site. And they had several providers doing that work for them over the year. And I would consolidated that data for them, and it was something between $50,000 and $75,000 a year to get that water extracted from their site. And they worked out if they had the sewer connected, if they paid for the sewer to be connected, they'd have a payback of less than 2 years. And it was really just bringing that data together and showing them the total. They really had no comprehension of the scale of what they were paying for it until we did this work for them.
Yeah. Yeah. Unbelievable. So tell me, is there anything being done with the overall data from all of these 60 assessments? Are we able now to start to compare industries with other industries within state, and are we comparing them to outside of state?
Yes, so we've compiled the data from the 60 companies or the 50 companies that we've assessed, some with reassessments, just to see if we could draw any conclusions or any findings from that. And we've just published a paper, the TEG Insights paper, which just goes through the data and the findings from that data. It can be difficult to compare. It's a bit hard to compare a food manufacturer with a fabricator, but we've tried to draw out some findings from it. What were the common themes that we found, and also, I mean, one of the interesting things that we found was the cost of electricity in regions actually did seem more expensive than it is in SEQ. So I thought that was quite an interesting finding.
So Penny, you gave me a slide, the maturity of manufacturers, and I'm going to put it on screen now. Can you take us through this slide and take us through, because this is really interesting stuff.
Yeah, so this is some of the results that have come out of the first stage of the assessment. When I mentioned we did that helicopter view of sustainability strategy for a company. And so you can see on the slide there, so, was about 95% of companies, they do have senior management commitment, and they really do want to try to improve their sustainability and do the right thing. But the problem is getting it integrated in what the companies are doing. So the results came out that there was only about 45% of companies had a sustainability policy in place. And that's sort of either environment or sustainability. There was only 45% that had that policy, which is a pretty basic component, really, of trying to roll out sustainability. There was a bit over 10% that had like a green team or a sustainability team that were trying to roll out actions across the company. And that's another important aspect as well, is just trying to get involvement from involvement across the workforce and trying to embed that culture. So that's a great starting point, is to have that green team in place. So not many companies were doing that. And then moving on to looking at, actions within job descriptions and just requirements, to try to, we're the whole company where we're trying to meet a 5% reduction in our energy use or whatever, and putting some of those things into job descriptions is another way to enforce is the wrong word, but encourage, those sorts of conservation and, saving energy, saving water, reducing waste is getting into the job descriptions. So, and then there's the KPIs and targets. So a lot of the companies, they had, soft is the wrong word, but they might have had targets in place, but they were things like reduce energy use or reduce waste without having sort of hard numbers around it. So, if there aren't hard numbers that you're trying to achieve, that's what makes it happen, I think, when you're actually trying to strive to meet a specific target. And there weren't many companies that actually had that in place. So that was less than 30%. Feel free to jump in, Jane, if you want to.
Yeah, I would say also that if companies sort of tick the box to say they had KPIs, quite often it was production targets, not sustainability targets. So again, not quite what we were thinking about in terms of
But
sustainability.
you would sort of expect that because they were in the beginning of this process anyway. They hadn't done any benchmarking.
Yeah.
So you'd hopefully when you revisit them, they would have started to have incorporated some sustainability KPIs.
Yes, and obviously as part of our report, we make a couple of suggestions. And it doesn't have to be, net zero by 2030. It can be small targets, reduce energy consumption by 5% or something. It really, something achievable that they can do. But again, as Penny said, setting that number, that hard number that they can track and target.
And
Yeah,
then
it's
there's
interesting. I see the support social and local enterprises on here. Companies are still pretty good at supporting local social enterprises.
Yeah, and most companies, particularly in the regions, they're part of the community. They're supporting the local footy team. They're helping out at the school. We had one company actually. I thought this was a pretty good initiative. If they got paid on time, so if their customers paid them on time, they donated 2 free meals to the school. So they were contributing to a social program, but also trying to get their bills paid on time so that their cash flow worked for them too.
I like it. So let's jump to talking about energy again, because you've got another slide I want to put up, and it's about where energy sources for electricity. Now, I'm assuming this is from their own generation, not taking it from the grid.
Yeah, that's right. We found that there was about a bit under 50% of companies had solar PV on site, and that was anything from maybe a 50 kilowatt to 100 kilowatt system. I think there was a handful of companies that had anything much bigger than that. But yeah, there still is a lot of scope to be, there's a lot of companies out there with a hell of a lot of roof space that they're not fully utilising. And manufacturers, they do generally use a lot of energy. So we did find that even the ones that do have solar panels, like on-site solar, it might only be contributing a small portion, 10 or 20% of their total energy use. But there's still opportunities that could be tapped into. Some of these companies, they're only doing a 5-day, or they're working just the weekdays, so 5 days, and then there's all that potential for solar energy on weekends.
They're using it during the day when it's being generated.
Yeah, that's right. So there's not many companies that are purchasing green power off the grid, for example. So that's a pretty straightforward emission reduction initiative, is to go with green power.
Yes.
There was, I don't think there were any companies that were doing that. There may have been one or two that have picked it up since we've done the assessment, but at the time of the assessment, there weren't any companies that were purchasing green power. There weren't any Queensland companies that had power purchase agreements in place. So there's big, obvious initiatives that can be picked up there. Do you want to add anything to that, Jane?
Yes, also we often found that those who had solar panels on their roof weren't monitoring them and weren't keeping an eye on them. So, and obviously, the only information we were really receiving was the electricity bill, and you can see that they have solar panels, but we couldn't see if those solar panels were operating properly. They either didn't have a monitoring app or access to the app, or quite often, so-and-so down, in that office over there has access and I don't have access. So the person who is actually trying to make energy decisions didn't have access to all the information. So definitely an initiative or a recommendation is to monitor your solar panels, because, quite often they'll stop working. The optimizers will stop working, even the inverters. To be honest, that's happened. Both of those has happened to my home solar system. And if we weren't monitoring that system, we wouldn't have realised.
Yeah. Yeah, look, we've got a number of SIM-PAC Live members that are in this space that offer flow power, offer PPAs for green energy and smart commercial solar. They're building a lot of solar systems, and with batteries now, these can actually be sources of revenue, and they can be sources of revenue to earn money for the company as well.
Or even just to help control their peak demand. If they
Yes.
can use batteries to, when they hit a certain amount of consumption, they just cover that top peak just to bring those costs down or to stabilise the costs so they don't get that bill shock. Because most of the companies are using over 100 megawatt hours and, are in a demand charge tariff, and that could help sort of smooth out their bills as well.
Yeah, it sort of rolls onto a general lack of understanding of the electricity that's being used, but more to the point, how it's being used. So there's very few companies have sort of energy monitoring and sub-metering, and particularly, if you're trying to do those things where you might have a solar and battery system and you're trying to reduce your peak demand, you really need that transparency and that clarity over how you're using your energy to make that system work for you to try to reduce the costs.
Penny, Jane, thank you so much for coming on the show. This is an incredible program that manufacturers should take advantage of. They should get in quick, sign themselves up before the subsidy expires. A 60% subsidy to having a benchmark program sounds like well spent money in the bank to me. And it's all the questions I had for you. If anyone else has any questions for either Jane or Penny, please put them into the chat in YouTube below, and we'll be online for the next 20 minutes or so, and we'll answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.